You begin with an assumption that rarely feels questioned. You assume that whatever exists must have begun. You assume that to exist is to be created. This assumption works well for objects, events, and even ideas. But it becomes unstable when applied to awareness itself. You know that thoughts appear and disappear. You know that memories change. Yet the knowledge of them remains. Ibn Arabi placed his inquiry precisely here. He asked whether the condition that allows anything to be known could itself be something that began. He did not ask this as devotion or poetry, but as a logical problem. If awareness is required for creation to be recognized, then awareness cannot simply be another created thing. If this is so, what exactly are you when you say, I? Ibn Arabi lived in a religious world structured around clear distinctions. God was understood as creator. The world was understood as created. Meaning was transmitted through authority, doctrine, and inherited interpretation. Ibn Arabi did not deny these structures outright. Instead, he examined the assumptions beneath them. He noticed that theology often described what should be believed without questioning how belief itself becomes possible, rather than beginning with God as an object of thought. He began with the act of knowing. This shift was subtle but disruptive. It moved a question from what is God to how is anything known at all. Many thinkers accepted answers without examining the process that made answers intelligible. Ibn Arabi refused this shortcut. His work did not aim to replace belief with doubt. It aimed to clarify whether belief rested on unexamined premises. When you question the conditions of knowing, doctrine no longer appears as fixed. It appears as provisional. This made Ibn Arabi difficult to classify and even more difficult to accept. Can a tradition remain intact when its conceptual foundations are examined rather than assumed? You are accustomed to thinking of creation as something that happens in time. There is a moment before and a moment after. Something begins, therefore it is created. Ibn Arabi asks you to slow down and examine this logic. Time itself is known only through awareness. You never encounter time directly. You encounter sequences of knowing. If time depends on awareness to be recognized, then awareness cannot be fully contained within time. This complicates the idea of creation. Is something created because it changes, or because it depends on something else to be known? If change defines creation, then awareness does not qualify, because it does not change in the way its contents do. If dependency defines creation, then awareness again resists classification, because nothing appears without it. Ibn Arabi is not offering a mystical exception. He is pointing to a logical gap. Creation, as a category, may not apply universally. If awareness is required for the concept of creation to make sense, then awareness cannot be explained using that same concept. What happens to your understanding of existence when its most basic category no longer applies? Ibn Arabi introduces a distinction that changes how reality is approached. He separates existence itself from the forms through which existence is recognized. What appears is not denied. Thoughts appear. Bodies appear. Events appear, but appearance is not treated as final. Appearances depend on conditions. They arise, shift, and pass. Existence itself is not encountered in this way. You never observe existence as an object. You observe things that exist. This difference is easy to overlook because language treats both as similar. Ibn Arabi insists they are not. Existence is that by which appearance is possible. It is not something added afterward. This destabilizes the assumption that reality is fully captured by description. You can describe what appears, but not the condition that allows description to occur. This does not make existence mysterious. It makes it fundamental. If what is most basic cannot be objectified, then where does certainty belong? Does it belong to what appears, or to what makes appearance possible? You usually assume that knowledge belongs to someone. There is a knower, and there is what is known. Ibn Arabi asks whether this division is as solid as it seems. You notice thoughts. You notice memories. You notice beliefs. Each of these is known. That means none of them can be the source of knowing. Even the sense of being a knower is something you are aware of. This leads to a difficult realization. The I you defend may not be the center of awareness. It may be one of its outcomes. Ibn Arabi does not suggest that the self is unreal. He suggests that it is secondary. Awareness is already present before any identity forms. The sense of ownership comes later. This reverses a deeply held assumption. You do not possess awareness. Awareness allows the sense of possession to appear. This is not a poetic claim. It is an observation about sequence. If awareness is prior to identity, then identity cannot explain awareness. What does it mean to live when the self is no longer treated as the source of knowing? When Ibn Arabi speaks of an uncreated light, he is not describing a thing. He is naming a condition. This condition is intelligibility itself. It is what allows anything to be present, understood, or known. It cannot be located or measured because it is not an object among objects. It is what makes objecthood possible. To call it uncreated is not to elevate it beyond reason. It is to acknowledge that it does not depend on prior conditions. Anything that depends on conditions can be traced. Awareness cannot. Every attempt to locate its beginning presupposes its presence. Ibn Arabi's claim is therefore logical rather than mystical. If something is required for all beginnings to be recognized, then it cannot itself begin in the same way. This does not turn awareness into a deity. It turns it into a prerequisite. You are not asked to believe in something extraordinary. You are asked to notice what is already functioning. If awareness does not depend on time, form, or identity, then what does it mean to say that it was ever created? Ibn Arabi is often misunderstood as denying distinction. This is inaccurate. He does not claim that differences are false. He claims that they are not ultimate. Multiplicity exists, but it does not exist independently. Each distinction depends on relations. These relations depend on a coherence that is not divided. This avoids two extremes. It avoids dualism, which treats divisions as absolute. It also avoids simplistic unity, which erases difference entirely. Ibn Arabi maintains distinction without granting it independence. This balance is difficult to hold conceptually. It requires precision rather than slogans. The world is not dismissed, nor is it equated directly with the absolute. It is understood as contingent. Meaning arises through relation, not isolation. When distinctions are treated as final, conflict becomes inevitable. When they are treated as meaningless, understanding collapses. Ibn Arabi offers a third position. Difference matters, but not absolutely. Unity is real, but not exclusive. How do you relate to disagreement when difference is neither denied nor defended as ultimate? If awareness is uncreated and identities appear within it, then the self cannot be foundational. It becomes a configuration. This does not make it useless. It makes it limited. Roles, beliefs, and narratives still function. They organize experiences, but they do not generate existence. Ibn Arabi does not ask you to abandon identity. He asks you to stop mistaking it for the source of being. This shift changes how responsibility is understood. Actions still matter. Decisions still have consequences, but they are no longer grounded in a fixed essence. They are grounded in context and relation. This removes the need to defend identity as absolute. Psychological conflict often arises from this defense. When identity is treated as final, it must be protected. When it is seen as provisional, it can adjust. Ibn Arabi's insight does not weaken ethical life. It clarifies it. You act without claiming ultimate authorship. You think without assuming absolute certainty. If who you think you are is not the source of awareness, what remains when identity loosens its grip? When knowledge is no longer owned by a separate self, certainty changes its character. It becomes flexible without becoming vague. Ibn Arabi's framework does not lead to confusion. It leads to precision. Claims are held provisionally. Understanding is allowed to adjust. This does not mean that anything goes. It means that knowing is recognized as a process rather than a possession. You participate in understanding rather than owning it. This has ethical consequences. It reduces the need to dominate conversations or finalize truth. This agreement becomes less threatening because identity is not at stake. Ibn Arabi does not promote passivity. He promotes clarity about limits. When you know without claiming ownership, humility arises naturally, not as a virtue to display, but as a logical outcome. If understanding occurs rather than belongs, then control is no longer necessary. How does this change the way you relate to belief, certainty, and the need to be right? The idea of an uncreated condition of knowing unsettles established structures. Institutions often rely on fixed definitions and mediated authority. If access to truth is not entirely external, control weakens. Ibn Arabi was not calling for rebellion. He was exposing a conceptual vulnerability. When meaning is no longer guaranteed by hierarchy alone, responsibility shifts inward. This frightened many of his contemporaries. His ideas were easy to misinterpret as relativism or heresy. In reality, they demanded greater rigor, not less. They required individuals to examine their assumptions rather than inherit them uncritically. This examination cannot be outsourced. It must be done directly. That is why it was resisted. Certainty is easier when it is given. It is harder when it must be understood. Ibn Arabi's work removes the comfort of unquestioned authority without removing structure entirely. What safeguards remain when certainty is grounded in clarity rather than control? The inquiry does not end with a conclusion. It ends with recognition. Awareness does not need to be claimed, defended, or explained. It is already operative before any explanation appears. Ibn Arabi's uncreated light is not a doctrine to adopt. It is a condition to notice when the urge to finalize understanding relaxes, clarity remains. Not as an answer, but as a basis. You began by assuming that everything must have begun. You now see that this assumption depends on something more basic than itself. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. If awareness was never the problem, what exactly were you trying to resolve?